I spent a morning last week in my doctor's office doing a not super fun activity, getting a bunch of blood drawn for a battery of tests, like a whole pile of vials. Because for the past 3 months, I've been really tired, like struggling just to stay awake until dinner time and having a lot of joint pain. My nurse practitioner's like, let's just see if we can rule something out, like rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune condition, and make sure that what's happening is just that you're struggling with surgical menopause. And throughout the week, I've been seeing the results come in, nothing super alarming, but signs pointed to the fact that there's a lot of inflammation happening in my body right now. Inflammation is a big buzzword in wellness circles right now and is often used as a blanket explanation for a lot of issues. You may have heard people talk about inflammation as a marker of toxicity in your body and how you need to cleanse it. But the fact is that our bodies create inflammation to defend against injury and infections and help us heal our tissues. But like we discuss later in this episode, sometimes if our bodies have been under real or imagined threats constantly for long periods of time, we will experience chronic inflammation, which can lead to symptoms like fatigue and pain, swelling, digestive issues, rashes, brain fog, changes in blood pressure and cholesterol, depression, anxiety. Sometimes those threats, real or imagined, sometimes those threats aren't so much physical as emotional. And sometimes they are wounds from our relationships, like in our childhood, like from our parents or caregivers, the people who were supposed to teach us what to expect from relationships for the rest of our lives, at a time when our brains were rapidly trying to figure out the world. Those relationships give you your attachment style: secure, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, which describes how you bond or don't bond with other people. When I first learned about attachment styles, I was in college, and I, like most people, went through that list and thought, well, I must have a secure attachment, because I felt strongly I had never been through anything that I would have called majorly traumatic. But like holistic therapist Megan Sherer explains in this episode, often the wounds that stick with us, the ones that create our attachment style and affect our relationships into adulthood, come from more subtle acts of emotional abuse, neglect, shame, and we might not always see those as traumatic. Trauma, if left unresolved, can show up in your body and in your relationships way down the line. As best-selling author and psychiatrist Bessel van de Kolk says, the body keeps the score. Our expert this week, Megan Sherer, has helped thousands of women create transformation in their lives and relationships as a holistic therapist. She has 11 years of training in somatic healing, hypnotherapy, yoga, meditation, and mindfulness-based therapy, among other things. And she's the author of Choose Yourself, coming in May 2025. And Megan shares in this episode that she has also struggled with autoimmune conditions that she can link to experiences earlier in her life. So many women like me, like Megan, maybe like you, have carried with them unresolved trauma that manifests later as chronic health issues. Today, we'll talk about trauma, attachment, and what that has to do with your body. In this episode, you will learn what trauma really is and how it affects us, how early attachment styles shape our relationships and our emotional health, and the connection between unresolved trauma, chronic illness, and our nervous systems. This episode may hit home for you if you have ever felt isolated or dismissed in your emotional or your physical health, have had these unexplained health issues, or have ever struggled to feel safe and loved in a relationship. I'm Micah Larson, and this is the Modern Hysteria podcast, where I shine a light on the taboo topics of women's health. Because even after studying health communication, I spent 10 years dealing with mysterious chronic illness, feeling isolated and wondering if I was crazy. Conditions that primarily affect women tend to be under-researched, undertreated, and underdiagnosed, leaving us to wonder if we are the problem. And throughout history, this meant women were burned at the stake, lobotomized, or called hysterical. This is Modern Hysteria. Megan, thank you so much for being here on Modern Hysteria to talk about a a few concepts. They're interrelated, they're a little bit complex, and they affect so many of us, myself included.
Thank you so much for having me, Micah. The platform and the topics that you share about are something that women really need to be hearing more of. So I'm happy to be a part of the conversation.
So, chronic illness, trauma, attachment, why are those things so critical for women to understand? And what are we talking about here?
Thank you for asking that question. I think it is important that we kind of define what we're digging into when we talk about the realm of attachment and trauma, and then how chronic illness sometimes plays a role in those things. I'll start with trauma. I think when people hear that word, it can be sometimes a little bit polarizing. People's minds often go to the idea of what we call big T trauma, those, overtly extreme traumatic experiences that everyone would consider to be like incredibly devastating or challenging, like accidents and death and war, and these like extreme examples of trauma that can impact us as individuals as well as the collective. And if you haven't had those experiences, then there can be this tendency to say like, oh, I haven't experienced trauma. Like my life hasn't been that bad. Who am I to complain, kind of thing. But the reality is a lot of the work that I do and that is really impactful and interesting, especially when we get into conversations about attachment work, are what we might call little T traumas. So more subtle experiences that impact us greatly, but that we might not have felt we've had permission in the past to explore because, again, maybe in air quotes, we think it's not that bad or that other people have had it worse. But I think the most important thing to identify in the realm of trauma is that it's not actually the experience itself that's the trauma, it's the aftermath. And one really central component of something being traumatic is the component of isolation. So if we feel like we're alone in the experience, we don't have any sort of support or social system to lean on when we're navigating that challenge, it can then present as trauma to our psyche, as something that now we feel overwhelmed by, that we don't have the capacity to manage. That's a really important distinction, especially when we're talking about childhood traumas and childhood wounds, because when you're a kid who's not getting your needs met fully, that is an inherently isolating experience. You don't have anyone to go talk to. You're not talking to your other like 7-year-old friends going like, are your parents like this? And do you feel this way? Right? We don't have the tools or capacity at that point. So we feel like it's just us, and isolation can really overwhelm the nervous system. So yeah, when we're talking about trauma and then the idea of attachment, it's how we learn to form bonds and connections with other human beings. And the first people we learn that from are our parents. The first person we learn that from is our mother. Our nervous system is really imprinted by her nervous system and informed by the state of her nervous system when we're still developing in the womb. And in those early years of our lives, we learn a lot about our place in the world and what love is or isn't available to us, and what we have to do in order to maybe perform for or earn that love or feel worthy of it. And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about attachment trauma, is those wounds, those misunderstandings that have caused us to feel separate from the love and connection that is inherently our birthright.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're seeing more and more these days women who are experiencing chronic symptoms, chronic pain, chronic illness that are often sort of mystery symptoms, like they don't have clear diagnoses or definitions in the realm of Western allopathic medicine. And women are often left feeling like, I'm crazy. And I love the name of your podcast.
Thank
because,
you.
This is going back many, many years. Women have often been called hysterical for simply pointing out, calling out what isn't okay in their relationships, right? In our culture, in our society. And women's nervous systems are attuned to those imbalances. When there's ruptures in relationships, we feel that deeply, and it impacts our entire system, our immunity, our physical, mental, emotional health. And, that's why we're seeing 80% of people who live with autoimmune conditions are women.
This is Micah with a quick aside. We mentioned ruptures here. Here's some context. Ruptures are when there's a break in connection between you and maybe your partner or your parent, like a conflict, maybe yelling or invalidating feelings, or maybe your parent said something hurtful or misunderstood you, basically failing to meet your needs. Ruptures are a normal part of relationships, but they can be harmful if there's no repair. Repair is when we restore connections after a rupture. It might look like acknowledging it, saying, I'm sorry I got upset, taking responsibility, like that was on me, and validating your child's feelings, like that must have made you feel really upset. A repair after a rupture can actually strengthen your relationship. Okay, back to the episode.
Just to kind of lay the groundwork for why this is so important, it's really like a reclaiming of our nervous system that we're talking about here.
Okay, Megan, you just did such a good job of bringing all three of these really big concepts together. So, trauma can be little t trauma. So, I was thinking about how this week I took my son to the movie theater for the first time and we tried to see The Grinch. And he is really sensitive to intensity in those storylines. And we had to leave after about 4 minutes. And it seemed like one of those times that, looking back, it could have been a little t trauma, an incident in which I bought the tickets, I bought the snacks, he wanted to leave. If I had said, keep your butt in the chair, we're not leaving, don't make a big deal about this, you're too sensitive, could that have been a little t trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you added the clarifier of like, if I had responded in this way, because that essentially creates that condition of isolation. He's now alone in his fear because he's made to feel like it's wrong, different, other, like you're not good for feeling that way. You're not normal for feeling that way. You should feel this way instead. That can feel so inherently isolating and then create this sort of internal dichotomy or resistance of like, okay, I'm very scared of this thing. I don't like this thing, but in order to keep my mom's attention, affection, acceptance, love, I need to pretend that this doesn't bother me. I need to pretend that I'm not feeling how I'm feeling. And that sort of loss of authenticity, loss of integrity, that can happen in lots of really small ways over time, right? And those repetitive small instances of little t traumas are what can really add up to big changes in our experience of attachment and relationships later on in life. And I'm sure as the loving mom you are, you were like, of course we can leave. You're scared, no problem. That totally makes sense. That's normal. We don't have to go see the scary thing.
Yeah, I think I benefit so much from my background in social science. I did learn about attachment. Of course, that was nothing compared to the experience of being a parent. Mm-hmm. And when he was about 18 months old, I started to have light bulb moments because I had to start making decisions about how I would parent him in ways that people call discipline. And how was I going to handle that? And my husband and I made the decision to do things somewhat differently than our parents did. And I felt like I didn't have a roadmap. So I turned to, I started therapy, which helped a lot because my therapist started teaching me about how attachment was playing out in my life and how I had an insecure attachment to my parents. And I became scared of creating an insecure attachment for my son. My therapist often has to tell me, you're doing a good job. Your son is securely attached. And just yesterday, I was at the doctor getting some labs drawn and looking at the markers of inflammation in my body. And it's interesting to think about how does stuff that happened 30 years ago, little t traumas and big T traumas, and the isolation that I felt after that, how is it possible that it's showing up in my body now? So can you connect the dots, Megan?
Yeah, absolutely. It can feel overwhelming when we do start to do this work and become more aware of how past and present experiences may be showing up in the body. And I've certainly faced that same question, and a lot of the clients I worked with have as well, where we're like, how do I start to unpack all those years of unprocessed emotions and unprocessed potentially traumatic experiences, and then sometimes feeling fear around like, how is that going to show up in my body? Am I going to have to face more pain in order for it to get better? The answer is that there's not like a clear cut and dried formula for navigating this work. But what I do know to be true is that when we are doing somatic work, which is essentially building our relationship with the body, right? Listening to our senses and how our body communicates with us. When we're doing that in combination with mind body therapies and practices like attachment work, understanding inner child work, and like how our past impacted us and how that's showing up now, What we're really doing is building a relationship with all of those parts that often had to get shut down in order to maintain connection. So the example we used, if your son felt like, okay, I can't express fear, I can't feel this feeling if I want to maintain this connection. That's all happening on an unconscious level or a subconscious level. We're not, 5 or 10 years old actively thinking those things. It's sort of instinctual. We instinctively know that we need connection to survive. We know that we need the support and love and care of our parents to survive. So our brilliant little psyches, even at a very young age, will do whatever it takes to maintain and preserve those connections. And then as an adult, we have the opportunity to start asking the questions like, okay, are the strategies that I used back then and the coping mechanisms that I learned back then, are they still working for me now? And the answer is often not so much. And we do see a lot of overlap with how that shows up in the body. And I think a way to begin to understand how that works is you can imagine that if you were a little kid who felt fear, whether it's something like the movie example we just gave, or maybe one of your parents is upset and they're getting angry and we're scared that they're angry and scared about what that might mean for us. When our bodies feel that fear and go into that stress response, you kind of contract, right? Like your muscles get tense and tight. Your body's in kind of this holding pattern, bracing to either fight, flight, flee, or freeze, right? And when those cycles of stress responses are not completed, like when we don't actually get to resolve it and realize like, okay, the threat is no longer a threat, or I'm safe, all is well, and get the support and co-regulation from another nervous system that we need.
This is Micah with another quick note. Megan mentioned regulation here. Self-regulation is the ability to calm yourself down and process your big feelings, maybe like taking deep breaths or practicing mindfulness. That regulates your nervous system and returns it to a nice baseline. Co-regulation is when one person helps another person regulate. And this is something that we teach our kids. Young kids rely on co-regulation because they do not literally have the cognitive ability to regulate their own nervous systems. I learned to help my son co-regulate by holding him in my lap and taking deep breaths. And you may co-regulate with your partner in a healthy relationship. But if we don't know how to regulate, then we might substitute that and engage in really unhealthy activities like disordered eating or substance abuse to numb that upset or stress. Okay, back to the episode.
When that doesn't happen, we have this really intricate system of tissue in our body called fascia. It lies beneath the surface of your skin. It's like connective tissue. And you can almost think of it like cotton candy, that like really thin, sort of fibrous type tissue that connects all of our muscles and nerves and joints and bones and internal organs. And when we have those patterns of holding, of contraction over and over again, that fascia, that connective tissue starts to tighten and restrict and stay in those restricted positions. And when that happens, we're not getting as healthy of blood flow, right? If there's an area of tightness, of stagnation, the blood isn't flowing there as efficiently. And when that happens, you mentioned earlier, inflammation markers, right? Inflammation is created if fresh blood flow, fresh oxygen isn't getting to all of our cells to deliver the nutrients that they need. Our body's just not working as efficiently as it could be. And our bodies are designed so brilliantly. I think this is something really important to call out right now if we're talking about chronic illness and chronic symptoms. Oftentimes people can feel, and again, I have felt for myself, that like our body is betraying us somehow. When we're in pain and we can't fix it, it feels like I'm broken, like my body's doing something wrong and I need to figure out how to make it right again, to make it be better again, to make it feel good again. And there can be that sense of like not feeling at home in the body because we feel betrayed by it. The most important paradigm shift or perspective shift you can ever have is that your body is 100% on your team. Your body isn't betraying you. Your body has just responded appropriately to your life circumstances and to the conditions placed upon the body, to the stress placed upon the body, to the emotions that you haven't had the tools or capacity to process. The body's doing its best to always find balance and homeostasis. And when there's a lot of built up tension or stress or emotion or trauma, in the body that hasn't been resolved, then finding balance often comes in the form of pain and symptoms. And that can be hard to wrap our heads around, but it ultimately can be a very empowering, because when you realize like, okay, we're on the same team, that's when you can learn to work with your body and listen to what it's telling you rather than feeling like I'm fighting against it constantly.
Oh my goodness. What a great explanation. So many things are coming together in my mind right now. My physical therapist recently described fascia as, like you said, cotton candy. Like when you peel an orange, all the pith membrane that surrounds the whole orange is like the fascia. And I realized when you have one tight spot, it really affects so much of your body. And inflammation, if you're listening to this and you hear the word inflammation, you think, oh my goodness, I've heard inflammation is so bad. I need to get rid of it. Inflammation is, like you said, Megan, a really important mechanism in our ability to fight off infection. So our body is doing something it needs to do, but doing it too well when it's inflamed. And so I'll use another personal example. I have PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I'm postmenopausal now, but something that was really hard for me to understand is even though I don't have periods anymore, PMDD is a hypersensitivity to hormonal changes in the body. And I only learned in the last year that what's really happening is my body stops transmitting serotonin and opioids, like what makes you feel good when you have a runner's high, like happy chemicals in my brain because of neuroinflammation. And that's the link that I was missing. Chronic stress and your body's inability to process that leads to inflammation, leads to illness.
Yeah, so it leads to symptoms, which can be
Okay.
in the form of pain, can be in the form of illness or dis-ease. And you know, you made such an important point that like inflammation in and of itself is not inherently bad. We actually need inflammatory responses. When you get a cut, your body has an inflammatory response. There's lots of blood cells sent to that area to heal, right? To like you said, prevent infection, but to also heal the skin. Our body inherently knows how to heal itself. Like our nervous systems are meant to go into fight or flight. Our nervous systems are meant to respond to potentially dangerous or threatening situations. It's like you said, when it gets stuck there, or when those types of experiences are happening chronically, happening so much that the body now is overwhelmed, kind of at capacity with its ability to respond to those stressors or to those threats, to that inflammation, that we start to experience symptoms. So I love this analogy when we're talking about the realm of chronic stress and symptoms, to imagine that we all have this inherent capacity to process these stressors. Imagine, if you will, a container like a cup or a bucket, and we all start with a clean slate, empty cup, empty bucket, and things like emotional stressors, physical and environmental stressors, so things that our body just like has to work to process every day, those things start to take up space in our cup or in our container. Trauma takes up more space in that container. It takes a lot of energy for the body to hold unresolved trauma, because we're essentially staying in that state of fight or flight. We're staying in that chronic sympathetic activation of the nervous system when we're not meant to be there 100% of the time. And eventually, when all types of different stressors, traumas included, fill that container, and it gets to the point where it's at capacity, every new thing that's added starts to overflow. The overflow is the symptoms, the chronic symptoms that we experience. And what I think is really important to pay attention to, because you know, I work in the realm of somatic therapy. I'm not a medical doctor. I have worked with many types of doctors and practitioners in my own life experience, having navigated many injuries, having lived with chronic autoimmune conditions, chronic Lyme disease, like a whole list, you name it, I've probably experienced it. And I worked with a lot of doctors to navigate the physical symptoms I was experiencing, some of which were incredibly helpful and beneficial in navigating those symptoms with impactful treatments, and many of which were not. Again, that's a whole nother conversation. Our Western medical system isn't always designed to support these types of chronic conditions. It's much better suited for acute injuries and acute conditions. Anyways, I digress. So coming back to this conversation here, my realm isn't the work of like, what treatments are we getting? It's important, of course, to like see the doctors you need to see and to address physically what's going on. But there's always agency that we have over the emotional component and the kind of mind body nervous system component when we're experiencing chronic conditions. I have never, ever seen somebody with a chronic symptom, whether illness or pain, that doesn't have some sort of underlying unresolved trauma that is correlated in some way. And that doesn't mean it's 100% the cause, but it's usually a big component that will relieve a lot of what we're experiencing. So I like to think of it like the body as messenger. And we can really look at a lot of these symptoms quite literally. I think when you look at a symptom or a pattern literally and start there, it can give you a lot of really valuable context and information. So you use the example of PMDD, right? This hypersensitivity to chemical and hormonal changes in the brain and in the body. We can look at that and think like, okay, my body has been experiencing a hypersensitivity, a hypervigilance to these hormonal changes. What does that remind me of? Where in my life did I learn that I had to be hypervigilant, hyper aware to changes in my surroundings in order to stay safe, in order to find that balance, that homeostasis? We can do that with certain autoimmune conditions, that are often described as like the body attacking itself. The body doesn't attack itself. If you understand it instead as my body is responding in some way, maybe my body's trying to protect itself from something, where might there have been an experience of needing to protect myself, to guard against something? And we can do that with any number of symptoms and conditions. It's a great place to start. It doesn't always tell the whole story, but again, we want to get curious about like, why is my body sending me this message?
So if we were to peel it way back, and the body as the messenger, the body keeps the score, is what some people say. Bessel van der Kolk is famous for his book called The Body Keeps the Score. But we have to go to the source of the message, which is our brain and the experiences in our lives that created these patterns. And when you say you are a holistic therapist, that's what you mean, in that we're not just looking at the body, we're looking at the brain and how these things work together. And so what does that mean? And what does your work look like with your clients as you address the brain and the body?
Yeah, that's such a great question. When we're talking about anything holistic, it's really essentially meaning just like all encompassing. Like we're looking at all parts of the self, not isolating one part and just putting band-aids on symptoms, rather than understanding the individual as a whole and getting to the root cause of a problem, the core wound. So that's a lot of the work that I do is exploration of what's the core wound of the pattern that we're seeing here. And a lot of my practice is working with women who've experienced attachment trauma, again, which is pretty much all of us when we're including those little t traumas. And they're seeing in their adult relationships, like, I'm not experiencing the kind of relationships I want to have, whether it's lots of anxiety in my relationships or I'm always attracting the same type of emotionally unavailable partner. The solution isn't just like manage your anxiety or stop choosing partners like that. The solution lies in understanding the core wound behind that pattern. So the same thing can be said for any physical symptoms, chronic illness symptoms that we're experiencing. We want to look at the person as a whole, their whole life story. That includes the beliefs they hold in their mind, right? And subconscious beliefs. That includes what's going on in their body, their relationship to their body, what they learned about their body growing up, pain that they're experiencing in the body. And then the nervous system is sort of the central component of this mind-body connection, because our nervous system consists of our brainstem and the systems of nerves that run all throughout our body, connecting so many vital organs and parts of the body. And it's that threat detector. It's that part of us that is looking out for whether we're safe or unsafe, and is sort of like the litmus test for whether connection with other people feels safe or unsafe. So when we experience ruptures in relationships, whether in childhood or adulthood, that impacts the nervous system. We might also look at, our sort of spiritual well-being as well. Like that's a component of our overall healing and health and wellness. And so for me, I use a lot of different modalities, from somatic work that can include movement, breath, sound, modalities like clinical hypnotherapy to work with the subconscious mind, parts work and inner child work, shadow work to work with those repressed parts of self and our psyche. All of these components matter, especially if we're addressing a chronic pattern of any kind, whether it's physical or emotional.
So you mentioned core wounds and trauma and ruptures. I think there are so many of us out there, myself included, because it took me years to, even after being diagnosed with PTSD when I was in college, it took me years to not laugh that off and say, nothing bad has ever happened to me.
Yeah.
You can make up any list of things. Well, this didn't happen to me, so I have never experienced trauma. People don't recognize what has happened to them as a trauma, big T or a little t. And what is that core wound? Can you give a few examples of what does a core wound look like so that they might recognize it?
Thank you for asking that. I really want to validate that experience, because it's actually the majority of the people that I work with have that experience of, I don't have anything traumatic that I can point to in my life. Like, I don't know why this would be happening. And that makes sense, right? Because if we knew why, if we could point to the core wound and we had the tools to resolve it, we wouldn't be experiencing what we're experiencing. So many of us are just kind of conditioned and socialized to not think the things we experience were bad or that bad or wrong, because it's sort of the water we swim in. Like, you're in it. You don't realize you're in it. You're just in it. And the goal isn't to just look for like what's bad, what went wrong, what happened that we could call a trauma, and just focus on that. We're looking for like perceived experience. What needs went unmet? And the part of us that's like, nope, I've never been through a big trauma, that can't be it. That part is brilliantly designed, because it's like, no, but if you do look deeper, you might find something that we've been avoiding that's really painful for a very long time. And like, we've intentionally avoided facing the fact that that's painful. And we actually want to honor that part. Now, to answer the second part of your question, some examples, like what could it be? It can be some of the more easily definable things, like growing up with, let's say, a parent who struggled with alcoholism or addiction. You could have had like really loving, well-intentioned parents who really wanted you and tried their very best to create a great life for you. And still, whatever way they were showing up wasn't how you needed your needs to be met. So maybe you had a parent who was always working, really, really busy, really, really working hard to put food on the table, to provide a life. And on the surface, like, what a loving thing to provide for your family. But if the resulting experience of that is like they were never around and I never felt good enough because as a kid, they weren't there when I needed them to be, when I was sick or when I was sad or when I had a performance or a recital, like they just weren't there. And maybe I internalized the story that like I'm just not good enough. Or maybe you had a parent, again, who loves you and wants the best for you, but was really demanding, like had really high standards for you. And if you didn't meet those standards, there was punishment. And there was a sense of like withdrawal of love. Like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy unless I meet their standards. That can be an experience of a core wound. Maybe you have a parent who is emotionally unavailable. Their parents weren't really attuned to their needs, didn't know how to communicate love and affection to them. And so they didn't learn how to do that. And they don't share those experiences with their children. It doesn't mean they don't love us, but if we have the experience of not feeling nurtured, not feeling protected or supported by them, we can't really get the emotional attention that we need for them. That's an unmet need. Like, it's not overt abuse or neglect, but to a little kid who just wants to be loved and cherished and adored and accepted and understood by their parents, which all little kids do. That is just an inherent biological need we all have, to different degrees in different ways. When that doesn't happen, we internalize those stories of I'm not enough, I wasn't worthy, I wasn't good enough.
So I was reading a book by a psychologist who said, I wish sometimes for my patients who experience trauma as children that they had been physically abused rather than emotionally abused, which sounds so crazy to say, but he said it's so much easier in retrospect to say, well, they hit me. If they had hit you, you know that that's a transgression and you can look back on it and say that was traumatic. But emotional abuse or neglect is insidious in that it's the lack of something that you may not even know that you're missing that's causing an attachment wound, that's causing these downstream effects in your adult relationships. It's so hard to even know that you're missing something that you desperately needed. So, how do you see those relational wounds play out, Megan? What do you see in your clients that might alert them to the fact that they have some of these wounds?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And there can often be a sense in family dynamics that like there's things we just don't talk about, or like you should respect your elders, or you need to feel XYZ about your parents because they're your parents. There's this sense of duty or obligation or guilt or shame in even admitting that maybe they did something that was harmful to us. Like that can be a barrier in and of itself to having these conversations. So we'll often start there. But when we say, I don't even know what I was missing, the body does know. So that's where we begin. Because again, like our body knows, our nervous system knows when we're not getting the safety, the connection, the love that we inherently need on a biological level to thrive as humans. Like especially babies and little kids, we actually need touch and affection and connection and nurturing to grow and thrive, not just survive. So we adapt, of course. If it's missing, we find ways to adapt both physically and psychologically to the fact that it's not there. And then we grow up and we become adults who have that hole in our soul and our psyche and our sense of self. And so that can show up in the form of like anxious attachment patterns in relationships, when I'm constantly feeling like I need that external validation from someone in order to feel okay about myself. It can also show up in the form of avoidant attachment patterns, like not letting people in because connection doesn't feel safe because we didn't have it in the way that we needed it, or disorganized attachment where we oscillate between the two. Because maybe we had an experience in childhood where there was instability, where sometimes we had that love and connection from a parent, and then they would get really angry and lash out, or then they would go drink and be absent. And so there was this up and down, like the people who loved us were also the people who harmed us or hurt us on an emotional or physical level. And so then in relationship patterns as adults, we see, I really want love and connection, but then I self-sabotage or I push it away because I'm scared of it. That's just relationally. When there's something going on in the body, that's also a great indicator that there's something to address. Whether it's I always have pain in my hip, or like my shoulders are always tight, or for women, honestly, like any sort of reproductive issues, any sort of pelvic pain, menstrual issues, they do not exist in a vacuum. And that's something I've had to navigate for myself in over many years, and it's been a lot of hard lessons unraveling the pain that it has existed in that part of my body and understanding like how that got there. It doesn't just show up like for no reason, right? We listening to like, what is my body telling me, is a really great indicator that there might be some unresolved wounding here.
So, for example, I have a disorganized attachment, had a disorganized attachment. My husband is, I think, the first secure attachment I've ever had. And even with him, maybe particularly with him, our relational issues often look like me pulling back from him because I think I don't need his support. I don't need anyone, and I don't trust anyone. And I don't like physical connection. And one of the hardest things for me was to learn that actually everyone needs physical touch and connection. And when you're a little kid, you need to regulate with your parent. And if you didn't have that, it shows up later. And it was baffling for my husband to understand, after being married we've been together for 10 years, when she needs me most, she's going to pull away the fastest because of my disorganized attachment. And that has been one of the hardest things, is to overcome the fear and anxiety I have about having him just hold me. And I realized how much I needed that when I finally asked, I'm about to have a panic attack. Can you please hold me? And it filled something that I needed. And it's amazing to feel the difference in my body probably my fascia, literally releasing tension.
Mm-hmm.
Is that along the lines of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. When we do start to ask these questions and explore, like, what are the patterns that are there? What are some of the underlying wounds that we can trace these patterns to? Well, first I'll say, because we've mentioned a few of the different attachment styles and attachment theory here, and that's become sort of a buzzword right now. It's really important that people know that understanding your attachment patterns isn't for the sake of labeling yourself as like, I'm anxiously attached and this is just the way I am, or I'm avoidant and that's the way I am. I'm disorganized and that's the way I am. Our attachment styles are not set in stone. We have the ability through neuroplasticity to rewire our attachment patterns, especially when we do find those healthy relationships that give us that new information, that new feedback of like, this is what healthy, this is what secure can feel like. So I want to just reassure people that it's not all doom and gloom when you identify the patterns. We identify them not just to manage the symptoms, but to understand the core wound, to heal the pattern, to build that sense of secure attachment. And it's not a perfect process. There will be so many moments where, like you kind of alluded to, you're aware of the pattern. And maybe there's a part of you that's like, I don't want to be pushing him away. I don't want to have to do it all by myself. But that's like an impulse. It feels like my survival strategy. Like I must do this to survive because that's what we learn. And our brains are wired to gravitate towards what is familiar and known, even if what's familiar and known is miserable and not great and not what we want. It's a comfort zone, and there's safety in that because it's predictable. Our brains can't predict what will happen with something that's unknown, and so we avoid it unless we become conscious of that pattern and actively make new choices. And like you again said, for your own experience, if you didn't have support, the support of loving, safe adults or individuals around you with healthy nervous systems to help you learn what regulation feels like, you had to do it all on your own. And so that's familiar. And letting someone in can be scary because letting someone in is a reminder of that old pain from our past. But for you to identify, like, okay, it actually did feel really good to be held. And even if it was scary, like I felt myself soften, I felt my body relax. If you do that enough times, that's where the rewiring happens, where then, okay, we'll gravitate towards reaching for connection rather than pushing away from it in a moment of stress.
And it speaks so much to the power of truly unconditional love. Everyone deserves it, but if we are fortunate enough to experience it, shout out to Eric, who is so patient and taught me what unconditional love looks like. We learned that relational wounds, and tell me if this is true, Megan, relational wounds can only be healed relationally.
Yeah, those ruptures that happened in our early attachment relationships, whether it was with parents or siblings or grandparents or teachers, people who are close to us, who are those attachment figures, something felt unsafe. We have to relearn what safe feels like in the context of a healthy person who's willing to show up and do the work with us. And that's 100% true. One thing that I like to be really clear about, though, is that that doesn't just exist in romantic relationships, because as a society, we pedestalize and glorify romantic relationships as the end all be all. And it can create a lot of shame and confusion for people who haven't found that safe person yet. And it can also lead people to end up in the wrong romantic relationships for them because we feel like, I need this in order to not feel alone. A lot of the most healing relationships that I've experienced have honestly been platonic, have been friends, have been amazing therapists or healers I've worked with along the way. I think for everybody, that gets to be true regardless of our relationship status, that there should never just be one special person who holds the keys to our emotional safety. That person is us and the support system that we build. So we're talking about healing and nervous system regulation. There actually has to be a balance of both co-regulation with those other healthy, loving nervous systems and self-regulation, self-soothing, which a lot of people don't learn how to do in healthy ways in childhood as well. So yes, absolutely. Relational ruptures happen in the context of loving relationships, and that includes partners, friends, therapists, and most importantly, our relationship with ourselves.
And so there's huge power in our friendships to teach us this is safe. It's an opportunity to learn to trust
Yeah.
That is such a testament to power of all friendships, but in my life in particular, my friendships with my girlfriends
Yeah.
has been powerfully healing because they are often struggling with the same things.
Yeah, female
So,
friendships are so medicinal. Like they really, I
yes.
know they can also be a source of a lot of pain for women, and there can be a lot of like trauma and things that don't feel great that maybe have women avoid female friendships, but when you find your people, female friendships are truly so healing, so medicinal.
Yes. So, Megan, I want to ask you, what does it mean when you write and talk about choosing yourself and your relationship with yourself in the context of attachment, trauma, and illness? Because you have a book coming out about it this in 2025, correct?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a concept that kind of bubbled up for me internally in my late 20s when I realized that I had been spending years of my life trying to get men to choose me, trying to get other people in general to choose me, and being whoever I thought I needed to be chosen by them. Because again, like we place so much value and importance on relationship status. And especially for women, like if you are not partnered or married by the time you're 30, then there's something wrong with you. And so that felt like all this pressure of like, I just need someone else to choose me, then I'll feel good about myself. I finally realized through a lot of not great experiences, a lot of trial and error, that in doing that, I was really self-abandoning. I was betraying my own core values, my authentic self again and again in order to be chosen. And that's really what pretty much all of us do as humans. Going back to the example we gave about your son in the movies early on, we learn to trade our authenticity for belonging. I learned to give up what I authentically think and want and feel if it means that I can belong and keep you around and keep this relationship. And especially as young girls and women, we do that so much that I think we lose our sense of self entirely. We don't know who we are. Who am I? What do I want? What do I value? Like the question, what do you want, used to like break my brain. It's like, whatever, what do you want?
Mhm.
That's what I want. You tell me the answer. And that is such a self-damaging place to be, but it's also just an inauthentic foundation to build relationships on. I can't build a loving relationship with somebody who doesn't really know me because I don't really know me. So choosing yourself is about reclaiming that authenticity and learning to honor what it is that you want, what it is that you value, who you are above being chosen by any one individual or group. Because yes, we need connection, but not at the sake of self-sacrifice. I was seeing these patterns show up so much that it just got to the point where I was like, okay, this needs to be talked about. I must write about this. The book sort of like wrote itself and has been a really fun process to bring to life. The book, which is called Choose Yourself, is all about helping us end those unhealthy relationship patterns and heal core attachment wounds and build a life that we love rather than a life that's for somebody else. And it comes out May 6th. And I'm very, very excited to get it out there. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, congratulations. Where will we be able to find Choose Yourself?
Yeah, it's being published with Sounds True Publishing, and you will be able to find it everywhere books are sold. It'll be on Amazon, it'll be at Barnes and Noble. I will have it listed on my website, available for pre-sale mid to late February. So if you keep an eye on my social media or get on my email list, that'll be the best way to stay in touch about it. I'm going to be including some fun like pre-order bonuses for people who pre-order the book. I'll send over some extra like relationship healing guides and guided meditations and fun content like that.
So, in the meantime, where can listeners follow you and get on your email list and hear from you until pre order?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram at my name, which is Megan Sherer. My website is also megansherer.com. And I recently launched my Substack as well. I know you're on Substack, but I've got
Yes.
a Substack called With Love, where I have a weekly newsletter that is all about what we're talking about here, all things love and relationship and healing related. So those are the best ways to stay in the loop.
And so you can follow Megan on Substack. Megan, Thank you so much. I'm wondering if we may know what is in your bag.
Absolutely.
What's in your
So
bag?
I've got my little crossbody here. I'm not a
Cute.
huge purse girl. I'm either wearing a fanny pack or crossbody, something that's easy to carry all the time, or a backpack when I'm traveling. And so I travel pretty light, but I, first things first, always have some sort of like lip gloss or chapstick. And I also carry, this is like my lifesaver. It's this oat and hemp that First Aid Beauty unfortunately does not make anymore. I stocked up on a bunch of these, and you can see I'm like, it's almost gone. And I'm going to be so sad when this is gone, because I used to have really bad eczema, and it's just a lifesaver for dry skin. So I carry it everywhere I go. Luckily, I don't really have eczema anymore. And that's a testament to a lot of what we've talked about here.
Yes, I was about to say that's an autoimmune condition.
Yeah.
And the mark of a great product is that you're like scraping the bottom of it.
I know. I like literally emailed their company, like, please, can you send me like whatever you have? They were just like, sorry, we can't do anything for you. So I'll need to find a backup. But
okay, eczema
that's
girlies.
a go-to. Eczema girlies. I always carry electrolytes. That's a go-to for me. I drink electrolytes every day. I will say that is one sort of chronic symptom that I haven't fully resolved yet. I have POTS, which I just experience like a lot of dizziness. And it's certainly gotten better over the years, but electrolytes help a lot. So always carry those with me.
Okay.
I have my AirPods because I'm always listening to music or podcasts. That's kind of like a go-to for me. Definitely identify somebody who's like sensitive in general to sensation and noise and things around me. So it's helpful for me to just have headphones in and focus on what I want to be hearing, rather than like leaf blowers and loud traffic and stuff like that.
Okay, totally resonates with me. I've asked my husband if he thought it would be socially acceptable to just wear noise canceling headphones all the time.
Honestly, like I so get that. I will often wear them I live in Seattle, so there's a lot of leaf blowing that happens around here. And like those kind of motorized sounds just really get me. They don't feel great to my nervous system. So I'll just walk around my house with noise canceling headphones in, sometimes without listening to anything, just because I want to tune down some of the outside noise.
Okay,
Part
great.
of a byproduct of getting more in your body is you do become a lot more aware of sensitivities and like how you react to the world around you. And while you ultimately can feel much more grounded and at home in yourself, you're also much more aware of the things that make you not feel so great. So I like to tell people that it's like, it's great to find the things that make you feel a little bit more regulated.
That's great permission to give, for sure. Just get like a little bit more sensitive after you become more aware.
Well, it's not that they're more sensitive, it's that you're not numbing anymore. You're not dulling the sensation. You're just more present to it.
Okay. That we're not dissociating, we're not ignoring all of the sensation.
Yeah, that's
totally
exactly
makes
it.
sense.
Okay, let's see what else I've got. I've got a couple more things in here. 100% of the time, always travel with like some form of ginger chews or ginger candy. I developed that habit, like always having a ginger chew after meals a while back, and it just settles my digestion. And then the last thing I have in here is a little CBD extract bottle.
What do you love CBD for? What does it do for you?
I use CBD primarily around my cycle. I have, like you, experienced a lot of challenges, not my whole life, but in especially the years where I was doing a lot of trauma resolution work, just pain around my cycle. I have a history of migraines as well. And CBD has helped me a lot with both physical pain and headaches and anxiety.
I'm always learning something new about how people use CBD. Thank you for opening up your bag, Megan, and for being so vulnerable and sharing so much with us. I can't wait to read your book and share it. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Micah. It has been such a pleasure, and I love the work that you're doing. Can't wait to continue the conversations.
In this episode, we talked about how trauma isn't just about extreme events. Even more subtle, little t traumas can have a lasting effect on our brains and our bodies. Attachment wounds shape our relationships, emotional health, and even our physical well-being. Healing is possible, and understanding the connection between our minds and our bodies is a really powerful first step. You can follow Megan Sherer on Instagram and on Substack. And get on her email list at megansherer.com to be one of the first to know when her book, Choose Yourself, is available for pre-sale. I also want to validate you. Your experiences are valid, and you are not alone if you've dealt with some of the topics that we've discussed today. Leave a comment or a rating on this podcast and tell us what you thought so we may reach other women who have felt the same way. Our next episode, Season 1, Episode 6, is about a different type of trauma. I interview OBGYN Callie Buckheit, MD, about her experience developing a life-threatening case of listeria when she was 27 weeks pregnant with her second child, and how it forever impacted the way she communicates with her patients who experience birth trauma, and what kind of permission we need to be able to heal from it or support other people who experience birth trauma. Thank you for tuning in and supporting the podcast. Remember, your story matters, your healing matters, and it's not all in your head.